With SAT, the best learning doesn't happen when you're doing practice tests, it happens afterward, when you analyze your performance and draw lessons on how to do even better in the future. Effective review is both an art and a science, so today I'm going to go over how to create effective review notes. Let's start with SAT writing. All prep students receive a review notebook, and inside you'll find my methodology for doing review, a sheet to help track your scores, some lined paper, and most importantly, a place to do review notes. Here you can see a couple different components to fill in. First, you should write down the identifying test information in the top box, and maybe the date as well. And beside that, write down the question type. And if you know the sub-concept of that question, be as specific as you can with including that. In the bottom left, there's space for you to write wrong and right answer choices. And I don't typically write all four myself, but I find it very useful to write the wrong answer, which I chose, as well as the correct one, which will help for my future review. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a couple things to include. First of all, you'll want to include sufficient context for the question in the form of a full sentence. That way you could refer back to this review note at a later time and not need your exam paper to understand what you got wrong and the correct answer. And last of all, include some notes to self, rules, patterns, and other tips and tricks which you can use in the future when you review. So again, essentially you want these review notes to be more than just a summary. It's kind of like a teaching tool, something that will help you to study in the future. So let's look at some samples. Okay, here it looks like the student has done a lot of work, but in fact these notes are really lacking in terms of substance. In many places I can see that answers are just dismissed as being grammatically wrong, but there's no real explanation about why they're wrong or what the correct rule is. And again, it's the rules that matter. There's also no context for the question. I don't see a lot of sentences that would help to clarify the correct and incorrect choices. So these notes probably won't be that useful for the future review. And lastly, there's too much emphasis on A, B, C, D answer choices, and it looks like the notes aren't really doing much more than just summarizing them. So I would say aim for quality, not quantity. And even though I'm going to be checking over your notes, make sure that they're most useful to you and not necessarily to me. Here's a second example. Now, this student has written out the entire SAT question, which is overkill. You don't have to do that, and it's not particularly helpful. Maybe in contrast, on the other hand, this is underkill. There's really not much of use here. So what's a good happy medium between these two? Let's look at a good example. Now here we can see all over the page that learning is visible. I can see grammatical rules, I can see grammatical patterns, I can see notes to self and good highlighting and underlining. It's a really good example of how ODAP notes, review notes, should be kind of teaching instructional tools and not just summary. We can also notice that full sentences are written down, which would allow this student to review in the future. Here's an alternative way to do review notes. You can see at the top that these are questions that are grouped according to a concept type, parallelism specifically. And looking up and down the page, we can see that these are questions from different dates that have all been collected into one section of the review notebook. And doing that, grouping by concept, makes it a lot easier to see patterns in your own mistakes. So it takes a little bit more effort and maybe planning in advance, but it's a great way to get organized in terms of fixing your mistakes. So you might want to consider doing it that way. Another alternative is to do online review notes. And if you do online review notes, you could very easily modify and update that information. So when you're gathering questions from different tests, maybe online would be the easiest way to do that because you could easily shift down, insert things before or after as necessary. And you might also consider using a database, which could help you keep track of your progress in a very organized way. You can see really good color coding of different concepts here. And the thing that I like most about databases is that you could use a formula to keep an updated count of your errors. So if that's something that appeals to you, then yeah, Google Spreadsheets might be a good choice. So that summarizes my strategy on how to do SAT writing review notes. And now we'll turn our attention to how to do review notes for the reading section. My most important piece of advice is to follow a consistent process when reading and solving, regardless of passage type or question type, and find out where along this line you've made an error. For many students, the issue comes from reading and understanding the passage, while others understand it but just have difficulty solving the questions. So let's go through each review process individually, and we'll start with reading. So again, whether it's literature, history, science, or social science, I want you to go through the passage and read it very slowly until you fully understand it. Don't worry about timing. Mark up the page, note all the transitions, the major ideas. You can annotate them right on the side. And if there's any vocabulary that you didn't understand the first time you went through this passage, you could look that up in the dictionary and mark that down as well. And by the end of this process, you should have a very highly annotated page that looks maybe something like this. And after understanding the passage very deeply, if you suddenly understand why you got a certain question wrong, that might signal to you that you don't need to spend too much more time solving the questions. You should spend more time during the test reading a little bit more deeply, or maybe just in general work on your reading comprehension. If reading deeply doesn't help you to understand why a question is wrong, then you can proceed to analyze your solving process. And we're eventually going to have annotations all across the questions too, but I'm going to go through this process slowly with you, so let's walk through one specific question. If you got a question wrong, the first step is to read the question again and make sure, first of all, that you actually read it correctly the first time. So if I read this question, it says, according to the narrator, one consequence of Silas adopting Epi is that he blank. And so I have to think, did I read it correctly? Yeah, I probably did the first time. And then I would proceed to the next step, which is identify the question type. So here, if I analyze this question, I can see it's a detail question, and it's a hunting subtype, which means there's no line reference. I just have to hunt in the passage for the answer. So I've read it correctly. I know the question type. You can see I'm following a process, and I have no problem on those first two steps. So here I have to think next, what's the strategy for beating details questions in terms of theory? And did I follow that theory in practice on the test? So for detail questions, I know that the theory is I look at the words, for example, consequence or adopting, the words from the question, and I find synonyms or restatements in the passage. That's how I beat this question type. And I further know that there are questions before that give us some context. For example, in question number 4, it's referring to line 7. And because the SAT typically is in chronological order, the questions are in chronological order, I could expect that question 5 will probably be somewhere after line 7. So this is all theory that I have that I can see whether I applied or not. And so let's imagine that, yes, I have applied that, and I've looked after line 7. Then I'll go to the next step. Check whether you were looking at the right lines in the passage. So if there's no line reference, did I find the correct place using other clues? And I believe, yes, we were looking at this part of the passage because it's after line 7, using that clue from the previous question. Now, if there are line references, did I read from the beginning to the end? Be very careful. A lot of times students kind of give up halfway through a line reference. If it says from line 17 to 32, please read all the way to 32. Just double check that you've read the full reference and make sure that you understand the lines and are not adding information or omitting any information. So let's go ahead and read these lines in the passage to make sure we're in the right spot. And remember, the question is asking, what is a consequence of Silas adopting Epi? And I'll read from line 7 in my head, and eventually I'll get to line 11, and I see the word Epi there. And so I'll read this out loud. It says, Epi was an object compacted of changes and hopes that forced his thoughts onward, his meaning Silas Marner's thoughts, onward, and carried them far away from their old eager pacing towards the same blank limit, towards new things that would come in the coming years. And when I have that down, I also like to write it on the page. That way, after reading it, I don't forget it. So I'll go back down to the question, and I'm going to just jot it down on my page. Epi forced his thoughts towards new things, and it's seemingly very positive from lines 11 to 15. Okay, now it's on my page and I could battle with A, B, C, D choices, maybe just drawing lines up and down to connect them to the correct answer. And this is the next step in our process. This is seeing if I've correctly eliminated wrong answer choices. So if the answer doesn't just jump off the page to you right now, you'd want to go through A, B, C, D, and using your knowledge of common distractor choices, you'll want to narrow down the answers. And just from looking these over, I think 3 of them would disappear almost right away. The first one, A, he has renounced all desire for money. We didn't read it, and also the word all, as you'll know from class, is an extreme answer choice. He doesn't have zero desire for money. If there's an extreme answer choice in the question, it has to be supportable in the passage. And B, he better understands his place in nature, was not mentioned. C, he's more accepting of help from others, is also not mentioned in those lines. And remember that oftentimes killing to solve is often easier than knowing the correct answer. So keep that in mind. And now that only D is left, we can move on to the final step, which is to make sure that every single word in the correct choice is supported. Now this is where most students make a mistake. You need to match every part of the answer choice to restatements in the passage, and you cannot infer anything. So looking at this question, it says one consequence of Silas adopting Epi, and in the passage it says Epi forced his thoughts towards, and that's a perfect match. That is a consequence of adopting Epi. And it says he looks forward to. He looks forward to matches his thoughts are going toward something else. Perfect match. And then he looks forward to a different kind of future. That is a perfect match for new things. So we can see that all parts of our answer choice are supported by the passage. There's no inference. It's all just restatements from the passage. And we could be absolutely sure that D is the answer. And so really your big task is to find where along this process of reading and solving you've made your mistake. And now zooming out at the whole process of reading and solving the question, we can see that this is what good review notes look like. A fully annotated passage and annotated questions. It's signaling a very well reviewed test. And after I do that for the whole test, what I like to do is create a takeaway point in my review notebook or online that maybe looks something like this. I would put the date at the top and maybe some of my major errors, notes to self, and then a couple things about what I should do before my next exam. So a couple things to keep in mind. A couple golden nuggets of wisdom here. Your main goal is not to know the correct answer to the question. It's to know how to get the correct answer to the next question, just like that one. Keep that in your mind. Another way to put it, what was past me thinking? What should future me do? That's maybe a similar way to think about it. And finally, as you're doing review notes, you gotta be relentless about understanding your mistakes. Don't give up for the day without fully knowing the reason for an error, or that question might slip by you in the future. Be relentless, nail it down, and you'll be really surprised how quickly your score will improve. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. I hope that clarifies about the review process. Good luck in your studies, and I'll see you in class.